Hey there, dear one. Go ahead and find yourself a comfortable spot. Lie down, just like that. Pull that blanket up a little higher. Dim the lights, or turn them off completely if you'd like. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Take a slow breath in, and let it out even slower. That's it. Just like that. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. I've made us a pot of chamomile tea, and I have a story for you. It's not a loud story, or a shocking one, though some might think the subject matter sounds that way. No, this is a gentle story. A story about women who lived long, long ago, and the quiet, determined ways they tried to shape their own lives. Tonight, we're going to talk about something that might seem strange at first. We're going to talk about birth control in the Middle Ages. Now, I know that sounds like it might be exciting or scandalous, but I promise you, the way we're going to tell it is anything but. We're going to meander through the gardens where medieval women grew their herbs. We're going to sit in candle-lit rooms where they mixed their remedies. We're going to walk slowly through their lives, understanding not just what they did, but why they did it, and what their days looked like as they went about the very human task of trying to control their own fertility. So close your eyes if you'd like. Let your breathing slow down. And let's step back in time together, to a world lit by firelight and candles, where the air smelled of wood smoke and herbs, and where women whispered knowledge to each other that had been passed down for generations. Let me start by painting you a picture of a woman's life in medieval Europe. Her name, let's say, was Agnes. Agnes lived in a small village in England, sometime around the year 1300. The village had maybe 40 families, clustered around a church and a manor house. Agnes was married at 15, which was common then, though many women didn't have children until their late teens or early 20s. Agnes's house was small. One room, maybe two if her family was fortunate. The floor was packed earth, covered with rushes that rustled when you walked across them. There was a hearth in the center, and the smoke rose up through a hole in the roof. At night, the whole family slept together in that one room, parents and children all sharing the warmth of each other's bodies and the dying embers of the fire. Now, in this world, children were seen as both a blessing and a burden. The church taught that children were gifts from God, and that to deliberately prevent conception was a sin. But the reality of life, the day-to-day struggle of feeding mouths and keeping bodies warm, well, that was more complicated. Agnes already had 3 children. 3 living children, I should say. She'd buried 2 others before their second birthdays. And she was exhausted. Pregnancy was hard on a woman's body, especially when she was also working in the fields, tending animals, grinding grain, hauling water, and doing all the countless tasks that made up a medieval woman's day. And childbirth, well, childbirth was dangerous. So very dangerous. There were no hospitals, no doctors rushing in to perform emergency procedures. There was a midwife, if you were lucky, and there were prayers, and there was hope. But many women died in childbirth, and many more were left weakened, their bodies never quite recovering. So Agnes, tired and worried about feeding another mouth, might seek out knowledge. She might whisper to her neighbor, a woman named Marjorie who seemed to have stopped having children even though her husband was still alive and well. Or she might visit the village wise woman, the one who knew about herbs and remedies, the one who could help with a difficult birth or a fever or, yes, with preventing pregnancy. And what would this wise woman tell her? What secrets would she share? That's what we're going to explore tonight, slowly and gently, as you drift off to sleep. We're going to learn about all the strange, fascinating, sometimes bizarre things that medieval women tried in their attempts to control their own fertility. Let's start with the herbs. Oh, the herbs. Medieval people lived much closer to the natural world than we do today. They knew their plants. They knew which ones could heal and which ones could harm. They knew which mushrooms were safe to eat and which would kill you. And they knew, with a certainty born of generations of careful observation, which plants could prevent pregnancy or end one that had already begun. One of the most famous of these plants, though it was already gone by the Middle Ages, was called silphium. Silphium grew in North Africa, near the ancient city of Cyrene, and it was so valuable, so incredibly sought after, that it was literally worth its weight in silver. The ancient Romans loved it. They used it as a seasoning, as a medicine, as a cure for all sorts of ailments. But most of all, they used it for birth control. The physician Soranus, who lived in the 2nd century, wrote about silphium in his medical texts. He said that a woman should take a piece about the size of a chickpea once a month, and it would prevent pregnancy. And if a pregnancy had already occurred, well, it could take care of that too. The demand was so high, the plant was harvested so relentlessly, that eventually it went extinct. The last stalk of silphium, according to legend, was given to the Emperor Nero. And then it was gone forever, taking its secrets with it. But silphium was just one plant among many. By the medieval period, women were using other herbs, other remedies, passed down through the generations. Let me tell you about some of them. There was pennyroyal. Sweet little pennyroyal, with its small purple flowers and its minty smell. It grew wild in many places, easy to find, easy to harvest. Women would brew it into a tea, strong and bitter, and drink it to bring on their monthly bleeding. Pennyroyal contains a substance called pelargon, and modern science has confirmed what medieval women knew. Pelargon can cause a uterus to contract, can bring on menstruation, can end a pregnancy. Of course, it was dangerous. The dose needed to end a pregnancy was close to the dose that could poison you. Too much pennyroyal and you might suffer terrible side effects, vomiting, dizziness, seizures, even death. But for a desperate woman, a woman who already had more children than she could feed, a woman whose body was worn out from bearing child after child, well, the risk might seem worth it. Then there was rue. Rue is a pretty plant, with bluish-green leaves and small yellow flowers. It has a sharp, somewhat unpleasant smell when you crush the leaves. The ancient Greeks and Romans used it, and medieval women continued the tradition. Soranus, that same physician who wrote about silphium, described rue as a powerful herb for preventing pregnancy and inducing abortion. How did it work? Well, rue contains compounds that can reduce blood flow to the endometrium, the lining of the uterus. Without a rich blood supply, a fertilized egg can't implant, can't grow. If a woman ate rue regularly, in her salads perhaps, or drank it as a tea, she might prevent pregnancy altogether. And if she was already pregnant, a stronger dose of rue might bring on bleeding, might end the pregnancy in its early stages. Again, it was dangerous. Rue could cause severe bleeding. It could cause pain and cramping. And in high doses, it too could poison you. But the knowledge persisted, passed from mother to daughter, from midwife to desperate woman, whispered in the shadows because the church condemned such practices, even though women continued to use them. Let's talk about Queen Anne's lace, too. You might know it as wild carrot. It grows along roadsides and in fields, with delicate white flowers that cluster together in a flat-topped umbrella shape. The Greek physician Hippocrates, who lived centuries before the Middle Ages, wrote about the seeds of Queen Anne's lace. He said they could prevent pregnancy and end one that had already started. Medieval women collected these seeds in late summer, when the flowers had dried and the seeds were ready. They would chew the seeds, or grind them into a powder and mix them with water or wine. Modern scientific studies, done in just the last few decades, have shown that Queen Anne's lace really does have anti-fertility properties. The seeds contain compounds that interfere with the production of progesterone, a hormone essential for maintaining pregnancy. Even today, in some parts of India, women use Queen Anne's lace seeds as a form of natural birth control. Imagine Agnes, our medieval woman, walking through a field in late summer. The sun is warm on her back. She's been working since dawn, but she takes a moment to stop by a patch of Queen Anne's lace. She carefully picks the dried flower heads, shakes the seeds into her hand. She'll dry them further when she gets home, store them in a little cloth bag, and take a small dose each day. It's not foolproof, she knows. Nothing is. But it's something. It's a way to try to take control, just a little bit, of her own body and her own life. There were so many other herbs, too. Pennyroyal we've mentioned, and rue, and Queen Anne's lace. But there was also wormwood, with its silvery leaves and bitter taste. There was tansy, with its bright yellow button-like flowers. There was savin, a type of juniper that was particularly dangerous and particularly effective. All of these plants contain compounds that can interfere with pregnancy, either preventing it or ending it. And women knew how to use them. They knew the right time to harvest each plant, the right part to use, whether it was the leaves or the seeds or the roots. They knew how much to take, though that knowledge was imperfect and the margin between an effective dose and a dangerous one was often small. They brewed teas and made tinctures and ground up dried herbs and mixed them with wine or honey to make them easier to swallow. This knowledge was precious. It was power, in a world where women had very little power. And it was carefully guarded. The wise women, the midwives, the herbalists, they were the keepers of this knowledge. They would teach it to their apprentices, to the young women who came to learn the healing arts. But they were careful about who they told and when. Because the church disapproved, and the penalties for openly practicing such things could be severe. Let me pause here for a moment and talk about the church's position, because it's important to understand the world these women lived in. The medieval Christian church taught that the primary, indeed the only legitimate purpose of sexual intercourse was procreation. Sex was for making babies, and that was that. Any attempt to separate sex from procreation was considered sinful. The theologians debated the fine points. Some argued that using herbs or other methods to prevent conception was equivalent to murder, since you were preventing a soul from coming into existence. Others said it wasn't quite that bad, but it was still gravely sinful. The penance for using contraceptives could be harsh: years of fasting, of prayer, of public confession. But here's the thing, the interesting thing: people did it anyway. Women did it anyway. The very fact that church leaders kept writing about it, kept condemning it, kept assigning penances for it, tells us that it was happening. It was happening a lot. If no one was trying to prevent pregnancy, there would be no need for all these sermons and all these rules. And in some ways, the church's own rules created a need for contraception. The church had very specific ideas about when married couples could and couldn't have sex. No sex on Sundays, because that was the Lord's day. No sex on Wednesdays or Fridays, because those were fast days. No sex during Lent, or Advent, or on any of the many feast days scattered throughout the year. No sex during a woman's menstrual period, or during pregnancy, or while she was breastfeeding. Add it all up, and there were only about 50 or 60 days a year when sex was officially permitted. Now, obviously, people didn't always follow these rules. But the rules created a sense that there were right times and wrong times for sex, and by extension, right times and wrong times to conceive a child. Let's drift back to Agnes for a moment. Imagine it's a cold winter evening. The children are asleep, curled up together under a pile of woolen blankets. Her husband, John, is sitting by the fire, mending a tool. Agnes is spinning wool, the spindle turning slowly in her hands, the rhythm soothing and familiar. She's thinking about the herbs she has hidden away, the little cloth bag of seeds tucked behind a loose stone in the wall. She's thinking about whether to take them, whether it's worth the risk. She's thinking about how tired she is, how her last pregnancy nearly killed her, how she's not sure she could survive another one. But she's also thinking about sin. She's thinking about what the priest said last Sunday, about the sanctity of life, about the duty of women to bear children. She's thinking about her soul, and what might happen to it if she dies having used these herbs, having committed this sin. It's a heavy burden. This knowledge, this choice, it comes with a weight. And Agnes carries it quietly, as women have always carried such things, hidden away in the private spaces of their hearts and their homes. Let's talk now about some of the other methods medieval women used, beyond the herbs. Because herbs weren't the only option, though they were probably the most common. There were other techniques, other strategies, some of them quite ingenious and some of them, well, quite strange. One of the most effective methods, though it's not really a method so much as a practice, was coitus interruptus. Withdrawal. This was probably the single most common form of birth control in the medieval period, just as it had been in ancient times and just as it continued to be for centuries afterward. It required cooperation from the man, of course. And the Church condemned it just as strongly as it condemned any other form of contraception. The sin of Onan, they called it, referring to a story in the Bible where a man named Onan spilled his seed on the ground rather than conceive a child with his brother's widow. For this, God struck him dead. Medieval preachers loved this story. They used it to illustrate the terrible sinfulness of withdrawal. But effective or not, sinful or not, people used it. Married couples used it. It was probably whispered about between husbands and wives, negotiated in the privacy of their beds. How often it actually worked, well, that's hard to say. It requires perfect timing and perfect control, and neither of those things is always possible. But for couples who desperately wanted to avoid another pregnancy, it was an option. Then there were barrier methods. Now, medieval Europeans didn't have condoms, at least not the kind we think of today. But they did have the concept of placing something in or over the genitals to prevent pregnancy. Women would use pessaries, small objects or plugs inserted into the vagina before sex to block the cervix and prevent sperm from entering the uterus. These could be made from all sorts of materials. Wool was common, especially wool that had been soaked in some kind of substance meant to kill or slow down sperm. What kinds of substances? Well, here's where it gets interesting, and a little bit strange. Medieval medical texts, drawing on ancient Greek and Roman sources, recommended all sorts of things. Vinegar was popular. Acacia gum was mentioned in some texts. Cedar oil, alum, pomegranate pulp, honey mixed with natron, a kind of salt. Some texts suggested using the scrapings from elephant tusks, though one imagines that was not terribly practical for your average medieval English peasant woman. The idea was that these substances would either form a physical barrier, making it harder for sperm to swim through, or they would kill the sperm outright. And modern science has actually confirmed that some of these would work, at least to some degree. Vinegar, for instance, is acidic, and acidity can kill sperm. Honey is thick and sticky, creating a barrier. Acacia gum, when it ferments, produces lactic acid, which is spermicidal. So a woman might take a small piece of wool, soak it in vinegar or honey or some other substance, and insert it into her vagina before having sex with her husband. Uncomfortable? Probably. Messy? Almost certainly. But potentially effective, at least some of the time. Some medieval texts also mention using half a lemon as a cervical cap, which sounds bizarre but actually makes a certain amount of sense. The lemon would form a physical barrier, and lemon juice is highly acidic, which would kill sperm on contact. This method was apparently still being used in some parts of the world as late as the 19th century. There were also amulets and charms. Now, we're moving away from methods that might have had some actual physical effect and into the realm of magic and superstition. But for medieval people, the line between medicine and magic was blurry. Many people believed that wearing certain objects, or carrying certain herbs, or reciting certain prayers could protect them from pregnancy. Weasel testicles were believed by some to prevent conception if a woman wore them tied around her thigh. Yes, you heard that right. Weasel testicles. I told you some of these methods were strange. Where this belief came from, I couldn't tell you. But it appears in various medieval texts, repeated matter-of-factly alongside other contraceptive advice. There were also instructions involving more symbolic or ritual actions. One text suggests that a woman should walk over the grave of a deceased relative at a certain time of the lunar cycle. Another suggests fitting 3 times into a frog's mouth. These methods clearly have more to do with folk magic than with any real understanding of biology, but they tell us something important about medieval worldview. People believed that the spiritual world and the physical world were deeply interconnected, and that actions in one realm could affect outcomes in the other. Let's slow down here for a moment. Take a deep breath. Feel the weight of your body sinking into your bed. Notice how relaxed your muscles are becoming. We're going to continue our journey, but there's no rush. We have all night. Time moves differently in the medieval world we're visiting. It's measured by the sun and the seasons, not by clocks. So just breathe, and listen, and let yourself drift. I want to tell you about a specific woman now, a real woman whose story has come down to us through letters and records. Her name was Margherita d'Attini, and she lived in Italy in the late 1300s and early 1400s. She was married to a wealthy merchant named Francesco, and we know a lot about her life because her husband saved all his letters, including the ones Margherita wrote to him. Margherita and Francesco were married for many years, but they had no children. This caused Margherita great sadness and distress. In medieval society, a woman's primary role was seen as bearing children, and a childless marriage was often viewed as a tragedy or even a divine punishment. Margherita tried many remedies to become pregnant. She consulted doctors, took various medicines, prayed at the shrines of saints known for helping barren women. But here's the interesting thing: Francesco had at least one child with another woman. So the issue wasn't his fertility, it was hers, or perhaps an incompatibility between them. And despite all her efforts, Margherita never conceived. I tell you Margherita's story because it reminds us that the desire to control fertility worked both ways. We've been talking about women who wanted to prevent pregnancy, but there were just as many women who desperately wanted to conceive and couldn't. And medieval medicine had remedies for that, too, though they were no more reliable than the contraceptives. Women seeking to become pregnant were advised to eat certain foods: eggs, chicken, foods thought to be warming and nourishing. They would take herbs like mugwort or lady's mantle. They would wear amulets, drink special potions, have masses said for them. If they were wealthy enough, like Margherita, they might travel to healing shrines or pay for expensive consultations with learned physicians. The line between fertility treatments and contraception was sometimes quite thin. Many of the same herbs that could prevent pregnancy in one dose might promote it in another. Medieval medicine was all about balance, about the humors of the body and keeping them in proper alignment. Too much heat or cold, too much moisture or dryness, any of these imbalances could prevent conception or cause a miscarriage. So the wise women who knew how to prevent pregnancy also knew how to encourage it. They were the keepers of women's mysteries, the practitioners of an ancient art that combined practical knowledge of herbs and the body with spiritual and magical elements. Let me tell you about the daily life of one of these wise women. We'll call her Matilda, and she lives in the same English village as Agnes. Matilda is older now, in her 60s, which is quite old for medieval times. Her own childbearing days are long behind her. She lives alone in a small cottage at the edge of the village, and people come to her for all sorts of ailments and needs. Matilda's cottage is filled with bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Lavender and chamomile for calming. Yarrow for wounds. Feverfew for headaches. Comfrey for broken bones. And yes, carefully stored away where children won't get into them, the more dangerous herbs: pennyroyal, rue, tansy, savin. When a woman comes to Matilda seeking help to prevent or end a pregnancy, Matilda doesn't judge. She's seen too much of life for that. She's seen women die in childbirth, leaving half a dozen children motherless. She's seen families starve because there were too many mouths to feed. She's seen young girls, barely more than children themselves, married off and pregnant before their own bodies were ready. So she listens. She asks questions. She tries to understand each woman's situation. And then she decides what to do. Sometimes she gives herbs, with careful instructions on how much to use and when. Sometimes she simply talks to the woman, helps her understand her own cycles, teaches her the rhythm method that women have always used, avoiding sex during the most fertile days of the month. And sometimes, she says no. If a pregnancy is too far along, if a woman is too sick or weak to safely take the herbs, if Matilda senses that the woman is being coerced by someone else rather than making her own choice, then she refuses. Because Matilda knows that this knowledge is dangerous as well as powerful. Used wrongly, these herbs can kill. Matilda learned her craft from her own mother, and from the village wise woman before that. The knowledge has been passed down through generations of women, an unbroken chain stretching back into the ancient world. It's not written in books, most of it. Oh, there are medical texts, learned treatises written in Latin by male physicians. But the everyday knowledge, the practical skills, these live in women's memories and women's hands. Let's talk for a moment about those medical texts, though. Because while most contraceptive knowledge was passed orally through women's networks, there were also written sources, and some of them are quite fascinating. One of the most important was a text called the Trotula, which was compiled in the 12th century in Salerno, Italy. Salerno was famous for its medical school, and unusually for the time, women could study there. The Trotula was a collection of 3 texts dealing with women's medicine, and while it was probably compiled by a man, it drew on earlier sources and may have incorporated knowledge from a female physician named Trota or Trotula who worked in Salerno. The Trotula includes all sorts of information about pregnancy, childbirth, and yes, contraception. It describes herbal remedies, pessaries, and other methods. Some of the advice is practical and sound. Some of it is bizarre to our modern ears. But what's important is that this text was copied and circulated throughout medieval Europe. It was translated from Latin into various vernacular languages. Women and men both read it and used it. Another important source was the work of Avicenna, a Persian philosopher and physician who lived around the year 1000. His massive medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, included a section on contraception. Avicenna described over 20 different contraceptive methods, ranging from herbal drinks to pessaries to magical amulets. What's interesting is that Avicenna was writing in the Islamic world, where attitudes toward contraception were quite different from Christian Europe. Islamic law generally permitted contraception, particularly coitus interruptus, as long as the wife consented. This more permissive attitude meant that contraceptive knowledge could be discussed more openly, written down more explicitly. When Avicenna's canon was translated into Latin in the 12th century, it became widely used in European medical schools. So ironically, even as the Christian Church condemned contraception, Christian physicians were learning about contraceptive methods from Islamic sources. There were also herbals, books describing plants and their medicinal uses. These were sometimes beautifully illustrated with drawings of each plant. A literate person could consult an herbal to learn what various plants could be used for. And while the herbals were often coy about explicitly mentioning contraception or abortion, using euphemisms or vague language, a reader who knew what to look for could find the information. Let your mind wander now through a medieval garden. It's spring, and everything is green and growing. There's a small plot of land behind a manor house, carefully tended. This is a medicinal garden, and it contains all the plants we've been talking about. There's pennyroyal growing in a sunny corner. Rue with its blue-green leaves. Tansy with its bright yellow blooms. Wormwood, silvery and aromatic. A woman is tending this garden. She might be the lady of the manor, or she might be a servant tasked with growing and preparing medicines for the household. She knows each plant intimately. She knows when to harvest each one, how to dry it, how to prepare it. This knowledge makes her valuable. It gives her a skill, a purpose, a certain kind of power. She's humming as she works, a tune she learned as a girl. The sun is warm, and bees are buzzing among the flowers. It's peaceful here, away from the noise and bustle of the household. For a little while, she can just be herself, working with her hands, connected to the earth and to all the generations of women who have tended gardens just like this one. Let's talk now about some of the more unusual methods that appear in medieval texts. Because once you start diving into this subject, you find some truly bizarre advice, things that make you wonder what people were thinking. For instance, some texts suggest that a woman could prevent pregnancy by wearing an amulet made from the womb of a female mule. Mules, being sterile hybrids, were associated with infertility, and there was a kind of sympathetic magic at work here, wear something from a sterile animal, and you too will be sterile. Similarly, There's advice about carrying or consuming parts of other animals believed to be sterile or to have special properties. The aforementioned weasel testicles fall into this category. So do instructions about using the liver of a cat or the blood of a hare. Now, did these things work? Of course not, at least not in any direct physical sense. But the placebo effect is powerful, and belief can shape outcomes in subtle ways. And perhaps more importantly, engaging in these practices gave women a sense of agency, a feeling that they were doing something to control their own fertility, even if that control was more psychological than real. There were also timing methods based on astrology. Medieval people believed that the movements of the stars and planets influenced events on Earth, including conception. Some texts advised avoiding intercourse during certain phases of the moon or when certain planets were in certain positions. Again, not effective in any scientific sense, but it represents an attempt to understand and control fertility using the knowledge systems available at the time. And then there were the methods that were simply based on misunderstanding of biology. Medieval people had only a vague idea of how conception actually worked. They knew that sex led to pregnancy, obviously, but the details were murky. Some believed that women produced seed just as men did, and that conception required the mixing of both seeds. Others thought that menstrual blood somehow formed the baby, with the man's seed providing the animating force. These misunderstandings led to some odd advice. For example, some texts suggest that if a woman got up and jumped up and down or sneezed immediately after sex, she could dislodge the man's seed and prevent conception. This advice actually goes all the way back to the ancient Greek physician Soranus, who recommended that after sex, a woman should jump backwards 7 times. Would this work? Well, not really. Sperm move very quickly, much too quickly to be dislodged by jumping. But the advice persisted for centuries, passed along in medical texts and folk wisdom alike. Another common piece of advice was that women were more likely to conceive if they experienced pleasure during sex. This belief was actually fairly progressive in some ways, as it acknowledged female sexual pleasure and suggested that it mattered. But it also led to the idea that if a woman didn't want to conceive, she should try not to enjoy sex, should remain cold and unresponsive. One wonders how many unhappy medieval marriages resulted from this particular piece of wisdom. There was also a widespread belief that women had certain fertile days during their monthly cycle, but the medieval understanding of when those days were was often exactly backwards. Many texts suggested that women were most fertile right before or during their menstrual period, when in fact those are among the least fertile times. This misunderstanding probably led to some accidental pregnancies when couples avoided sex at the wrong times. Let's return to Agnes for a moment. It's been a few years now since we first met her. She's in her 30s, and she has 5 children living. She did get pregnant twice more after the night we visited her, despite her use of the herbs. Or perhaps she stopped using them, deciding to leave things in God's hands, or perhaps her husband objected, or perhaps she simply ran out of the seeds she had harvested. But now, she's beginning to enter that stage of life when fertility naturally wanes. Her monthly bleeding has become less regular. Sometimes months go by without it. She's tired, more tired than she's ever been, but in a way there's a relief in this. The constant worry of pregnancy, the fear that has been her companion for nearly 20 years, is beginning to ease. She thinks sometimes about the younger women in the village, the ones who are just beginning their childbearing years. She wonders if she should share what she knows, the herbs and the methods, the little tricks for trying to space pregnancies. But she's afraid. The church's condemnation weighs on her, and she's heard stories of women accused of witchcraft for knowing too much about such things. So she stays quiet. And the knowledge remains hidden, whispered only in the most trusted circles, passed from mother to daughter in hurried conversations, shared between friends in low voices. This secrecy, this hiddenness, is one of the reasons why it's so hard for us today to know exactly how common contraception really was in medieval times. The records are scarce. The church condemned it, so people didn't talk about it openly. Medical texts often used euphemisms or coded language. And of course, Women's history in general was less likely to be recorded than men's. But we can piece together clues from various sources. Court records sometimes mention contraception or abortion in the context of criminal trials. Penitential manuals, the books that priests used to assign penances for various sins, include contraception and abortion on their lists, which tells us that these were common enough problems to warrant specific mention. Sermons railed against these practices, another sign that they were happening. And then there are the medical texts we've mentioned, which wouldn't exist if there weren't a demand for the information they contained. Why write detailed instructions about contraceptive methods if no one is trying to use them? Let's drift now into the wider social world of medieval Europe and think about why women might want to control their fertility. We've touched on some of these reasons already, but let's go deeper. First, there was the simple physical toll of repeated pregnancies and childbirths. A woman's body needs time to recover after giving birth. Modern medical advice suggests waiting at least 18 to 24 months between pregnancies. But in medieval times, without reliable contraception and with strong social and religious pressure to have children, many women became pregnant again within a year of giving birth. This rapid succession of pregnancies could leave a woman's body depleted. She might suffer from anemia, from weakened bones due to loss of calcium, from pelvic floor damage, from any number of conditions that we now know are made worse by closely spaced pregnancies. And remember, medieval nutrition was often poor, especially for peasants. A woman who was malnourished to begin with had even less reserve to draw on. Then there was the danger of childbirth itself. Maternal mortality was high. Estimates vary, but perhaps 1 or 2% of births resulted in the mother's death. That might not sound like much, but remember that women often gave birth 10 or more times in their lives. Over the course of multiple pregnancies, the cumulative risk became substantial. A woman might have a 10 or 15% chance of dying in childbirth over her lifetime. The causes of maternal death were many: hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor, eclampsia. And there was very little that could be done. Midwives were skilled and experienced, but they didn't have surgical tools or antibiotics or blood transfusions. If something went badly wrong, a woman would likely die, and often her baby with her. So the fear of death in childbirth was real and rational. And for a woman who already had several living children, who knew that those children needed her, the idea of risking another pregnancy might be terrifying. There were economic reasons, too. Children needed to be fed, clothed, housed. In a peasant family living at the edge of subsistence, another mouth to feed could mean the difference between getting by and starving. And it wasn't just food. Children needed shoes, or at least rags to wrap their feet in winter. They needed bedding, they needed space in the cramped cottage, they needed care when they were sick. For wealthier families, the concerns were different but no less real. Noble and merchant families worried about inheritance, about dividing property among too many heirs. They worried about providing dowries for daughters, which could be expensive. They worried about maintaining their social status, which required a certain level of wealth and display. And then there were the social and emotional reasons. Simply put, women were exhausted. The work of raising children, in an age without any labor-saving devices, was endless and grinding. Water had to be hauled from a well or stream. Clothes had to be washed by hand, in cold water, and hung to dry. Food had to be prepared from scratch, grain ground, bread baked, vegetables harvested and preserved. And all of this while caring for infants and toddlers who needed constant supervision. Medieval homes were full of dangers. The open hearth where a baby could burn herself. The well where a toddler could drown. The animals that might kick or bite. A mother had to be constantly vigilant, and if she had several small children all at once, that vigilance was nearly impossible to maintain. Is it any wonder, then, that some women sought ways to limit their pregnancies? That they turned to herbs and pessaries and any method they could find, despite the Church's condemnation, despite the risks? Take another slow breath now. Feel yourself relaxing even more deeply. We're going to continue our story, but you don't need to hold on to every detail. Just let the words wash over you like a gentle stream. I want to talk a little bit about the role of midwives in all of this. Midwives were central to medieval women's lives. They attended births, of course, but they also served as general healthcare providers for women's issues. They treated menstrual problems, vaginal infections, fertility issues, and yes, they helped women prevent or end pregnancies. Midwives occupied an interesting position in medieval society. On one hand, they were essential and respected. A skilled midwife was a treasure to a community. On the other hand, they were often viewed with suspicion, especially by the church authorities. They had knowledge that seemed mysterious, almost magical. They dealt with matters of blood and birth and death. They had the power to save lives or, if they chose, to end them. In some times and places, midwives were required to take oaths that they would not provide abortifacients or contraceptives. They were supposed to report women who requested such things to the church authorities. But how often did they actually do this? It's hard to say. The bond between a midwife and the women she served was strong, built on trust and shared experience. It seems likely that many midwives quietly helped women control their fertility, regardless of what the official rules said. The relationship between midwives and the church became more fraught during the late medieval period, particularly as concerns about heresy and witchcraft increased. Midwives, with their knowledge of herbs and their association with women's secrets, were sometimes accused of witchcraft. The infamous witch-hunting manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1486, specifically mentioned midwives as being particularly prone to witchcraft, claiming that they killed babies or rendered women sterile through diabolical means. These accusations were largely nonsense, of course, based on misogyny and fear of women's power and knowledge. But they had real consequences. Midwives could be investigated, tried, even executed. And the threat of such accusations surely made some midwives more cautious about what knowledge they shared and with whom. But let's not end on such a dark note. Let's think instead about the resilience and ingenuity of medieval women. Despite all the obstacles, despite the church's condemnation and the lack of reliable methods, women found ways to exercise some control over their own bodies and lives. They preserved and passed on knowledge of herbs and techniques. They supported each other through the shared experience of trying to balance the desire for children with the need to limit family size. This was a kind of quiet resistance, never openly acknowledged, never celebrated, but real nonetheless. And it's part of a much longer history of women's efforts to control their fertility, a history that stretches from ancient times through the medieval period and right up to our own day. Let's imagine one more scene. It's twilight in that medieval village where Agnes lives. The day's work is done, and people are gathering in their homes for the evening meal. Smoke rises from cooking fires, and the air smells of wood smoke and stew. In Agnes's house, the children are eating their dinner, squabbling gently over who gets the biggest portion. Her husband is talking about the next day's work in the fields. Agnes is tired, as always, but there's a contentment in this moment. Her children are healthy, fed, safe. She's survived another day, another year. She's managed, somehow, to keep going. Later, when the children are asleep and the house is quiet, she might think about the choices she's made, the herbs she's used or not used, the risks she's taken. She might wonder if she's sinned, if God will judge her harshly. Or she might simply feel grateful for the knowledge she has, imperfect as it is, and for the other women who shared it with her. And in that, she's connected to women across time and space. To the ancient Roman woman who used silphium. To the Greek woman who chewed Queen Anne's lace seeds. To women in other parts of the world using their own traditional methods. And to us, today, with all our modern medical knowledge, still grappling with questions about fertility and choice and control over our own bodies. The story of medieval birth control is really a story about being human. About the universal challenges of reproduction and child-rearing. About the lengths people will go to in order to shape their own destinies, even in small ways. About knowledge passed between women, hidden from official view but preserved across generations. about making difficult choices in difficult circumstances. Let's talk now about some specific plants in more detail, because I find there's something soothing about learning the particulars of herbs and their uses. The repetition, the gentle accumulation of detail, it's like counting sheep, in a way. Peaceful and calming. Pennyroyal, as we mentioned, is a member of the mint family. Its scientific name is Mentha pelagium. It grows low to the ground, spreading along the surface, with small oval leaves and tiny purple flowers arranged in whorls around the stem. If you crush the leaves, they smell strongly of mint, but with a sharper, more medicinal edge than the mint you might use in cooking. Pennyroyal grows wild in many parts of Europe, particularly in damp areas near streams or in meadows. But it's also easy to cultivate, and medieval herb gardens often included it. It had many uses beyond contraception. It was used to flavor foods, particularly meat dishes. It was used to repel fleas and other insects, scattered on floors or hung in bunches. It was used to treat colds and coughs, to bring down fevers, to ease digestive complaints. But its most potent effect was on the uterus. The pelargon in pennyroyal causes the uterus to contract. In a pregnant woman, these contractions could bring on menstruation or cause a miscarriage. The plant was so strongly associated with this use that its common name in some regions was literally abortion herb. To use it, a woman would make a tea from the leaves. She might use fresh leaves if it was summer and the plant was growing, or dried leaves that she'd harvested and saved. She'd steep a handful of leaves in boiling water, let it cool a bit, and then drink it. The taste was strong and bitter, not pleasant, but bearable, especially if she mixed it with honey. The danger, as we've said, was in the dose. A little pennyroyal tea might bring on a late period or end a very early pregnancy. But too much could cause violent cramping, vomiting, dizziness. In extreme cases, it could cause seizures, liver damage, even death. The margin of safety was not large, and without precise measurements or standardized preparations, it was all too easy to take too much. Modern medicine recognizes pennyroyal oil as toxic, and it's strongly advised against using it, especially during pregnancy. But for medieval women, with few other options, it was a risk some were willing to take. Rue, that blue-green plant with a strong smell, has an equally long history. Its scientific name is Ruta gravolens, and it's native to the Mediterranean region but was widely cultivated in medieval gardens throughout Europe. Rue is a perennial, meaning it comes back year after year, growing into a bushy plant about 2 feet tall. The leaves are somewhat fleshy, divided into smaller leaflets, and covered with tiny glands that contain aromatic oils. In addition to its contraceptive uses, rue was used for a wide variety of medicinal purposes. It was thought to improve eyesight, and ancient Roman painters supposedly ate it to keep their vision sharp. It was used to treat headaches, earaches, and joint pain. It was believed to protect against poison and plague, and people would carry sprigs of it or hang it in their homes for protection. The Greek physician Dioscorides, writing in the 1st century CE, recommended rue as an amenagogue, a substance that stimulates menstrual flow. Soranus, writing a century later, described it more explicitly as a contraceptive and abortifacient. This knowledge passed into medieval European medicine through translated Arabic texts and through oral tradition. A woman using rue might prepare it in several ways. She could eat the leaves fresh, perhaps in a salad, though the taste is quite bitter. She could make a tea from the leaves, similar to pennyroyal. Or she could extract the juice and drink it mixed with wine or honey to mask the flavor. Rue contains several active compounds, including pilocarpine and rutin. These compounds can affect the uterine lining and interfere with implantation of a fertilized egg. They can also stimulate uterine contractions. Like pennyroyal, rue could cause severe side effects if taken in large quantities, including photosensitivity, skin rashes, and gastrointestinal distress. Interestingly, rue is still used in some parts of the world today for similar purposes. In some Latin American countries, women drink rue tea as a form of emergency contraception or to induce menstruation. and modern scientific studies have confirmed that rue does have anti-implantation and abortifacient properties, at least in laboratory animals. Queen Anne's lace, or wild carrot, is another fascinating plant with a long history of use in fertility control. Its scientific name is Daucus carota, and it's the wild ancestor of the cultivated carrot. In fact, if you dig up a Queen Anne's lace root, it looks and smells like a carrot, though it's usually smaller and tougher. The plant is biennial, meaning it takes 2 years to complete its life cycle. In the first year, it produces a rosette of feathery, fern-like leaves. In the second year, it sends up a tall flower stalk, sometimes 3 or 4 feet high, topped with a flat cluster of tiny white flowers. These flower clusters are quite beautiful and delicate, and in the center of each cluster, there's usually one tiny dark purple flower, which according to legend represents a drop of Queen Anne's blood. After the flowers are pollinated, they produce seeds. These seeds are small and ribbed, covered with tiny bristles. And it's the seeds that have contraceptive properties. Women would collect the seeds in late summer or early fall, when they were ripe and dry. The seeds could be chewed directly, though they're somewhat unpleasant tasting, or they could be ground up and mixed with water or another liquid. The recommended dose, based on traditional use, was about a teaspoon of the seeds, taken within 8 hours of unprotected intercourse. This would make it a form of emergency contraception rather than an ongoing preventive method. How does it work? Research suggests that Queen Anne's lace seeds interfere with progesterone synthesis and implantation. They may also have effects on the corpus luteum, the structure in the ovary that produces progesterone after ovulation. Without adequate progesterone, a fertilized egg cannot successfully implant in the uterine wall. Studies done on laboratory animals in the 1970s and 80s showed that extracts of Queen Anne's lace seeds could prevent pregnancy in rats and guinea pigs. The effectiveness varied but was sometimes quite high, approaching 80 or 90%. Of course, studies in animals don't necessarily translate directly to humans, but they do suggest that there's a real pharmacological effect at work here, not just placebo or folklore. Queen Anne's lace is still used by some women today as a natural form of contraception, particularly in communities that practice herbal medicine. There are anecdotal reports of effectiveness, but of course, without large-scale clinical trials, it's impossible to say exactly how reliable it is. And as with any herbal preparation, potency can vary depending on the growing conditions, the time of harvest, and the preparation method. Close your eyes now if you haven't already. Let your breathing slow even more. We're going to continue talking about plants, letting the details wash over you like a lullaby. Each plant has its own story, its own place in the garden of medieval medicine. Tansy is a plant with bright yellow button-like flowers that grow in flat-topped clusters. The scientific name is Tanacetum vulgare. It's a tall plant, growing 3 or 4 feet high, with deeply divided leaves that have a strong, somewhat unpleasant smell when crushed. Some people describe the smell as camphor-like. Tansy was common in medieval gardens, used for various purposes. The leaves could be used to flavor custards and other dishes, though you had to use them sparingly because of the strong taste. Tansy was used to preserve meat, to repel insects, and as a dye plant, producing yellow and green colors. It was also used in Easter celebrations in some regions, baked into special cakes or puddings. But tansy also had a darker use. It was known as an abortifacient, and a strong one at that. Tansy contains a compound called thujone, which is toxic to the nervous system. In high enough doses, thujone can cause seizures and death. The amount needed to cause abortion is dangerously close to the amount that can cause serious poisoning. Medieval women would have known to be extremely careful with tansy. A tea made from a few leaves might be used to treat intestinal worms or to stimulate digestion. But to end a pregnancy would require a much stronger dose, one that carried serious risks. Nevertheless, desperate women did use it, and sometimes they died from it. Another dangerous plant used for similar purposes was savin, a type of juniper. Savin, or Juniperus sabina, is an evergreen shrub with scale-like leaves and a strong, resinous smell. It's native to the mountains of Central and Southern Europe and was cultivated in some medieval gardens, though it wasn't as common as some of the other herbs we've discussed. Savin was notorious as an abortifacient. The plant contains a compound called sabinyl acetate, which is highly toxic. It causes severe irritation of the gastrointestinal tract and the urinary system, and it can cause uterine contractions. But it can also cause kidney damage, liver damage, and death. There are medieval records of women dying from savin poisoning, and by the early modern period, savin had acquired such a dark reputation that merely possessing it could arouse suspicion. It became associated with criminal abortion and with women who were trying to hide pregnancies from illegitimate relationships. The fact that these dangerous plants were used tells us how desperate some women's situations must have been. To risk your own life in order to end a pregnancy, you would have to be in truly dire circumstances. Perhaps you were an unmarried woman facing disgrace and destitution. Perhaps you were a married woman whose last pregnancy had nearly killed you and you knew you couldn't survive another. Perhaps you simply had more children than you could feed and you could not bear to bring another baby into the world only to watch it starve. Let's breathe together for a moment. In and out. Slowly. There's a heaviness to this topic, I know. But remember that we're not dwelling on the tragedy. We're simply bearing witness to these women's lives, honoring their struggles and their choices. And then we're letting it all drift away into the past, where it belongs, while we rest here in the present, safe and warm and peaceful. Let's turn to some of the less dangerous herbs, the ones that were used more as general women's tonics and that might have had some contraceptive effects as part of their broader action on the reproductive system. Lady's mantle is a lovely plant with pleated, fan-shaped leaves that catch drops of dew in their centers. The scientific name is Alchemilla vulgaris. The flowers are tiny and yellow-green, clustered together in loose sprays. Medieval alchemists were fascinated by the droplets of water that collected on lady's mantle leaves, believing them to be a pure form of water that could be used in their experiments, hence the Latin name Alchemilla. Lady's mantle was used to treat a wide variety of women's complaints. It was given to women with heavy menstrual bleeding to help reduce the flow. It was used to treat vaginal infections and inflammation. It was given to pregnant women near term to help prepare the uterus for childbirth. And after birth, it was used to help the uterus contract back to its normal size and to promote healing. With such a range of uses, it's not surprising that lady's mantle might also have been used to regulate fertility. A woman who took lady's mantle regularly might find that her menstrual cycles became more regular and predictable, making it easier to avoid conception using timing methods. The plant contains tannins and salicylic acid, which have astringent and anti-inflammatory properties. Mugwort is another plant with a long association with women's health. Its scientific name is Artemisia vulgaris, and the genus name comes from Artemis, the Greek goddess associated with childbirth and women's mysteries. Mugwort is a tall, weedy plant with deeply lobed leaves that are green on top and silvery white underneath. The flowers are small and inconspicuous, clustered along the stems. Mugwort was used for many purposes in medieval times. It was believed to protect travelers, and people would put sprigs of it in their shoes or carry it with them on journeys. It was used to flavor ale before the widespread use of hops. It was burned as an incense in rituals and ceremonies. And it was used extensively in women's medicine. Mugwort was primarily known as an amenagogue, a substance that promotes menstrual flow. Women with delayed or absent periods would drink mugwort tea to bring on their menses. Whether this was being used as a contraceptive or abortifacient is hard to say. A woman whose period was late might have been pregnant, or she might simply have had an irregular cycle. By taking mugwort, she was covering both possibilities. If she wasn't pregnant, it would help regulate her cycle, and if she was pregnant, it might end the pregnancy in its very early stages. Mugwort contains a compound called thujone, the same substance found in tansy and wormwood. But mugwort contains it in much smaller amounts, making it safer to use. Modern research has shown that mugwort can indeed stimulate uterine contractions, though the effect is relatively mild. Wormwood, Artemisia absinthium, is another member of the Artemisia genus, closely related to mugwort. It's famous today as the flavoring ingredient in absinthe, the green liquor that was popular in 19th century France and gained a reputation as a dangerous and possibly hallucinogenic drink. Wormwood has silvery grey leaves and an intensely bitter taste. Its primary use in medieval medicine was as a treatment for intestinal worms and other parasites, hence the name. But it was also used as an amenagogue and abortifacient. Like tansy, wormwood contains significant amounts of thujone and had to be used carefully. Too much could cause seizures, kidney damage, and death. Medieval medical texts often mention wormwood in the same breath as other potentially dangerous herbs, with warnings about proper dosage. A little bit to expel worms or stimulate digestion was fine. More than that, and you were taking serious risks. Let's think for a moment about how these herbs would have been prepared and stored. A medieval woman with a garden would harvest her herbs at the right time of year, usually in summer when the plants were in full growth or flower. She would cut the stems or pick the leaves or flowers, tie them in small bundles, and hang them upside down to dry in a shady, well-ventilated place. The rafters of her house might be festooned with drying herbs, filling the air with their scents. Once dry, the herbs would be stripped from their stems and stored in containers. Pottery jars, wooden boxes, or cloth bags, each labeled or simply known by memory. A careful housewife or herbalist would check her stores regularly, discarding any that had become damp or moldy, making sure she had enough to last through the winter. When she needed to use an herb, she would take a small amount, perhaps a handful or a pinch depending on the herb and the intended use. For a tea, she would place the herb in a cup or pot, pour boiling water over it, and let it steep for several minutes. For a stronger preparation, she might simmer the herbs in water or wine for a longer period, making a decoction. The liquid would be strained and drunk, sometimes flavored with honey or spices to make it more palatable. For a pessary, she might take a small piece of wool or linen, soak it in a preparation of herbs, oil, or other substances, and insert it into the vagina before intercourse. The pessary would be removed afterward, though sometimes it might be left in place for several hours or even overnight. These were intimate, private acts, carried out in the quiet spaces of women's lives. There was a ritualistic quality to them, a sense of connecting with ancient knowledge and with other women across time who had done the same things. Your breathing is slow and even now. Your body is heavy and relaxed. We're going to continue our journey, but you're drifting along peacefully, not holding onto anything, just floating on the current of the story. Let's talk about some of the non-herbal methods medieval women used, or were advised to use, for contraception. We mentioned earlier the idea of using pessaries or vaginal suppositories. Let's go into more detail about what these would have been like. The concept of blocking the cervix or creating a hostile environment for sperm in the vagina is actually quite ancient. Egyptian medical papyri from thousands of years before the medieval period describe pessaries made from crocodile dung, honey, and sodium carbonate. Whether these were actually effective is debatable, but the idea that you could place something in the vagina to prevent conception clearly goes way back. By the medieval period, the materials used for pessaries were somewhat less exotic, but still quite varied. Medical texts translated from Arabic sources suggested using wool soaked in oil. The idea was that the oil would slow down or immobilize sperm. And actually, modern science confirms that oil-based substances can indeed have spermicidal effects. So this was one of the more rational and potentially effective methods available. Other texts suggested using wool soaked in vinegar. Again, this actually makes sense. Vinegar is acidic, and sperm are very sensitive to pH. An acidic environment can kill sperm, or at least reduce their motility significantly. A woman might soak a small piece of wool or linen in vinegar, squeeze out the excess, and insert it before intercourse. Some texts mention using honey, either alone or mixed with other substances. Honey is thick and sticky, which would create a physical barrier, making it harder for sperm to swim through. Honey also has mild antibacterial properties, though whether this would extend to sperm is less clear. More elaborate recipes appear in some medieval medical manuscripts. One might call for a mixture of white lead, ground sea snail shells, and opium, formed into a suppository. Another might suggest using pomegranate pulp, alum, and acacia gum. The ingredients for these more complex preparations would have been expensive and hard to obtain, so they were probably only available to wealthy women. Acacia gum is particularly interesting because, as we mentioned before, when it ferments it produces lactic acid, which is spermicidal. In fact, acacia was used in some commercial spermicides in the early 20th century, before more modern alternatives were developed. So the medieval physicians who recommended it, or the ancient physicians whose work they were translating, had somehow figured out through trial and error that this substance was effective. The practical realities of using these pessaries must have been challenging. First, there's the question of privacy. In a 1 or 2 room house where the whole family slept together, when and how would a woman insert a pessary without being observed by her children? Probably late at night, in the dark, after everyone else was asleep. Then there's the question of insertion. Without modern applicators, a woman would have to use her fingers to place the pessary as deeply into the vagina as possible, ideally covering the cervix. This requires a certain amount of anatomical knowledge and physical dexterity. But women were probably more familiar with their own bodies than we sometimes assume. Certainly, midwives would have been very familiar with female anatomy and could have provided instruction. The pessary would need to be removed afterward, presumably the next morning. This would be another delicate operation, requiring the woman to reach in and pull out the wool or linen, which by now would be soaked with bodily fluids and possibly quite messy. And of course, there's the question of effectiveness. How well did these pessaries actually work? Without modern clinical trials, it's impossible to say for certain. But given that some of the substances used, oil, vinegar, acacia, do have spermicidal or barrier properties, it's plausible that they had some effect. They certainly wouldn't have been 100% effective, but they might have reduced the chances of conception to some degree. Another non-herbal method that appears in medieval texts is the use of timing, trying to avoid intercourse during a woman's fertile period. The problem, as we mentioned earlier, was that medieval understanding of when a woman was fertile was often backward. Many medieval physicians believed that women were most fertile right before or during menstruation. This belief seems to have come from a misunderstanding of the relationship between menstruation and fertility. Because menstruation is so obviously connected to reproduction, it was assumed that the time around menstruation must be the most fertile time. In reality, of course, a woman is least fertile during her period and the days immediately before it. Ovulation typically occurs around the middle of the menstrual cycle, roughly 2 weeks before the next period begins. This is when a woman is most fertile. But medieval physicians and laypeople alike didn't understand ovulation, so they got the timing wrong. Despite this misunderstanding, some women may have stumbled onto effective timing through their own observation and experience. A woman who carefully tracked her cycles and noticed when she seemed most likely to conceive might have figured out the pattern, even without understanding the underlying biology. And of course, there was always the method of abstinence. Simply avoiding intercourse altogether was and is the only 100% effective form of contraception. But for a married woman, prolonged abstinence was difficult. There were social expectations, there were wifely duties, and there was her husband's desire to contend with. The Church's rules about when sex was and wasn't permitted actually provided something of a framework for periodic abstinence. If a couple strictly followed all the Church's prohibitions, no sex on certain days of the week, during certain seasons, during pregnancy and breastfeeding, during menstruation, they might have sex relatively infrequently, which would naturally space out pregnancies. And prolonged breastfeeding was actually one of the more effective natural methods of birth control available to medieval women. When a woman breastfeeds frequently, especially at night, it can suppress ovulation for many months. This is called lactational amenorrhea. A woman who breastfed each child for 2 or 3 years might not become fertile again until the child was weaned. Medieval women may not have understood the hormonal mechanisms involved, but they would have observed that women who breastfed tended to have a longer interval before the next pregnancy than women who didn't. And this knowledge could be used deliberately. A woman who wanted to avoid pregnancy might breastfeed her child longer and more frequently than she otherwise would. Of course, this wasn't foolproof. Lactational amenorrhea works best when a baby is exclusively breastfed and nurses frequently. Once solid foods are introduced, or if the baby starts sleeping through the night, ovulation can resume. But it was still one of the more effective methods available. Let your mind drift now to a quiet scene. A woman sitting by a window in the late afternoon sun, nursing her toddler. The child is old enough to eat solid food, old enough to walk and talk, but still comes to the breast for comfort and nourishment. Outside, other children are playing. Inside, the woman and child sit together in a pool of golden light, rocking gently. This is a moment of peace, of connection between mother and child. But it's also, though the woman might not think of it in these terms, a form of contraception. A way of spacing pregnancies. A brief respite before the next baby comes. Medieval life was hard, but it had its moments of grace. Its quiet beauties. And medieval women, for all the challenges they faced, found ways to navigate their lives, to make choices within the constraints they lived under, to exercise what agency they could. Let's talk now about the legal and ecclesiastical consequences of using contraception in the medieval period, because this is an important part of the context. As we've mentioned, the Church condemned contraception and abortion. But what did that condemnation mean in practical terms? It depended very much on time and place. In the early Middle Ages, roughly 500 to 1000 CE, the Church's position was still being developed. Different regional church councils made different pronouncements. Some were quite harsh, equating contraception with murder. Others were more lenient. Penitential handbooks from this period, books that listed various sins and the appropriate penances for each, include contraception and abortion. The penances varied but could be quite severe. A woman who used herbs or potions to prevent conception might be assigned several years of fasting, of prayer, of exclusion from communion. If she had ended a pregnancy, the penance might be even harsher, sometimes as much as 10 or 15 years. But here's the key point: these were penances, not criminal punishments. Using contraception was a sin, something you confessed to a priest and did penance for, but it wasn't a crime that would be prosecuted in a secular court. You wouldn't be thrown in jail or executed for trying to prevent pregnancy. In practice, how often women actually confessed to such things is debatable. Confession was private, between the penitent and the priest. And many women may have simply not mentioned it, or may have framed it in such a way that the priest wouldn't realize what they were talking about. A woman might confess to using herbs to regulate her menstrual cycle or to treat an illness, without specifying that those herbs were also intended to prevent or end a pregnancy. By the later Middle Ages, roughly 1200 to 1500, the Church's position had become more systematized. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas had written extensively about the ethics of sex and reproduction. The consensus was clear: contraception was sinful, because it separated the act of sex from its procreative purpose. But even as the theological condemnation became more explicit, the practical enforcement remained limited. Parish priests were supposed to ask about such things during confession, and to assign appropriate penances. But they couldn't force people to confess, and they couldn't know what happened in the privacy of people's homes. There were exceptions, cases where contraception or abortion became a matter of public scandal and was prosecuted. If a woman died from taking an abortifacient herb, an investigation might follow. If an unmarried woman was suspected of ending a pregnancy to hide evidence of fornication, she might be brought before a church court. And as we mentioned earlier, midwives and wise women who were known to provide such services might come under suspicion, especially during periods of heightened concern about heresy or witchcraft. But these were relatively rare cases. Most women who used contraception or abortifacients did so quietly and suffered no official consequences. It's also worth noting that attitudes varied across different parts of Europe and among different social classes. In Mediterranean countries with closer ties to Islamic culture, where contraception was viewed more permissively, practices may have been more openly discussed. Among the nobility and wealthy merchant classes, access to learned physicians and expensive remedies was greater, and there may have been more willingness to bend the rules. And always, there was a double standard. When theologians and preachers condemned contraception, they often focused their ire on women, portraying them as deceitful and sinful for trying to avoid pregnancy. Men's role in the matter was less frequently discussed. Yet methods like coitus interruptus required male cooperation and male self-control. The sin, if sin it was shared. But the blame fell disproportionately on women. Take another deep breath. Let the tensions of this medieval world, with all its rules and judgments, fade away. We're just visitors here, observing from a safe distance. None of this can touch you now. You're safe and comfortable, drifting toward sleep. Let me tell you about one more historical figure, a medieval physician whose work sheds light on these practices. His name was Constantinus Africanus, and he lived in the 11th century. He was a merchant and a scholar from North Africa who eventually settled in southern Italy and became a monk. Constantinus is important because he translated numerous Arabic medical texts into Latin, making them available to European physicians for the first time. Among these translations was a work on sexual health and reproduction that included information about contraception and abortion. The text described various methods, herbal drinks, pessaries, timing methods, even surgical procedures. It was matter-of-fact in tone, treating contraception as simply one aspect of medical care, without the moral hand-wringing that characterized Christian theological writing on the subject. When Constantinus's translations began to circulate, they caused something of a stir. Here was medical information that contradicted church teaching, or at least, that presented practices the church condemned as if they were normal and acceptable. Some church authorities wanted to suppress these texts. But they were too valuable, too useful to physicians, to be completely eliminated. So they remained in circulation, copied and recopied throughout the medieval period, read by physicians and surgeons, and presumably consulted by some of the women who could access such learned medicine. The contradiction between church doctrine and medical practice persisted, unresolved. This contradiction is actually one of the most interesting aspects of medieval contraceptive history. On one level, official church teaching said these practices were sinful and forbidden. But on another level, medical texts described them, physicians knew about them, and ordinary people used them. Medieval society was not monolithic. People found ways to accommodate conflicting demands, to maintain public piety while making private choices that contradicted that piety. Let's turn now to the question of how effective medieval contraceptive methods actually were. This is difficult to answer with any precision, because we don't have reliable statistics on pregnancy rates or contraceptive use from the medieval period. What we can say is that family sizes in medieval Europe varied considerably, and that there's evidence of deliberate family limitation in some times and places. Demographic studies of medieval populations show that not all women had as many children as biologically possible. The average married woman might have 5 or 6 children over her lifetime, when without any contraception at all, she might have 10 or 12. Some of this spacing between pregnancies can be explained by breastfeeding, by periods of malnutrition or illness that affected fertility, by the Church's prohibitions on sex at certain times. But it's likely that deliberate contraceptive practices also played a role. Comparisons with other pre-industrial societies that used similar herbal methods suggest that effectiveness rates might have been in the range of 50 to 80%, depending on the method and how carefully it was used. That's not as effective as modern contraceptives, which can be over 99% effective, but it's not negligible either. For a woman using Queen Anne's lace seeds regularly, or inserting vinegar-soaked wool before intercourse, or drinking pennyroyal tea to bring on a late period, the chances of avoiding pregnancy over the course of a year might be significantly better than if she did nothing at all. And even a modest reduction in fertility, say from an average of 10 pregnancies to an average of 6 or 7, would make a real difference in a woman's life and health. Of course, effectiveness varied greatly depending on knowledge and access. A wealthy woman with access to learned physicians and expensive ingredients might have more reliable methods available than a poor peasant woman relying on folk remedies and local herbs. A woman living in a city with an established community of midwives and wise women might have better information than a woman in an isolated rural area. And individual circumstances mattered too. A woman who carefully tracked her cycles, who had a cooperative husband willing to use withdrawal or abstain at fertile times, who could afford to breastfeed her children for extended periods rather than sending them to a wet nurse, would have better odds of controlling her fertility than a woman without these advantages. The picture that emerges is one of a lot of individual variation and a lot of uncertainty. Medieval women did not have reliable contraception in the way that we understand it today. But they weren't completely helpless either. They had options, imperfect and sometimes dangerous options, but options nonetheless. And they used them. They experimented, they shared information, they passed down knowledge through generations. They made choices, within the constraints of their time and place, about their own bodies and their own reproductive lives. Close your eyes and imagine a garden at dusk. The sky is turning from blue to purple to indigo. Stars are beginning to appear. In the garden, herbs are growing quietly in their beds. Pennyroyal and rue and tansy and all the others we've talked about tonight. They're just plants, really. Innocent in themselves. It's human knowledge and human need that give them meaning and power. A woman walks through the garden, her footsteps soft on the earth. She pauses by a plant, touches its leaves gently. She's thinking about her choices, about what she needs, about the path ahead of her. And then she continues walking, out of the garden, back toward her house where a candle flickers in the window. We're going to start bringing our story to a close now, though you're welcome to drift off to sleep at any point. There's no need to hear the ending. The story will go on without you, just as history goes on, rolling forward like a slow river, carrying us all along. What have we learned tonight about medieval birth control? We've learned that it existed, first of all. That despite church condemnation and social stigma, women sought out ways to control their fertility. We've learned about herbs like pennyroyal, rue, Queen Anne's lace, tansy, savin, mugwort, and wormwood, each with its own properties and dangers. We've learned about pessaries and barrier methods, about timing and abstinence and breastfeeding. We've learned about the wise women and midwives who kept this knowledge alive, passing it from generation to generation. We've learned about the medical texts, both Arabic and European, that describe these methods in matter-of-fact terms. We've learned that medieval women's lives were hard, that pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous, that the burdens of child-rearing were immense. We've learned that women made difficult choices in difficult circumstances, balancing religious teaching against personal need, weighing the risks of contraception against the risks of continued pregnancy. And we've learned that this history is part of a much longer story, a story that includes ancient Roman women using silphium, includes women in all times and places trying to shape their own reproductive destinies, includes the ongoing debates and struggles over contraception and abortion that continue to this day. But tonight, we're not going to dwell on modern debates. Tonight, we're just going to rest with these medieval women, bearing witness to their lives, honoring their struggles. We're going to let their stories cradle us gently as we drift off to sleep. Imagine Agnes one more time. She's an old woman now, in her 60s, her childbearing years long behind her. She's survived. She's raised her children, seen them grow and marry and have children of their own. She's a grandmother now, and she sits by the fire in the evenings, watching her grandchildren play. Sometimes, younger women come to her for advice. She's careful about what she says, but she offers what wisdom she can. She teaches them about herbs, about the rhythms of their own bodies, about the ways women have always helped each other through the challenges of fertility and childbearing. She doesn't talk about sin or salvation. She doesn't preach or judge. She simply shares what she knows, woman to woman, generation to generation. And in doing so, she becomes part of that long chain of women's knowledge, stretching back into the past and forward into the future. The fire is burning low now. The children are asleep. The house is quiet. Agnes sits and rocks slowly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes half closed. She's thinking about her life, about all the choices she's made, all the roads traveled. She's tired, but it's a good tired, the tired of a life fully lived. And as she sits there in the firelight, the boundaries between past and present begin to blur. She's not just Agnes anymore. She's every woman who's ever faced these questions, made these choices. She's the ancient Roman woman and the Greek woman and the modern woman. She's all of us, connected across time by the simple fact of being human, of having bodies that create life, of needing to navigate the complex intersection of biology and desire and circumstance. Let yourself drift now. Let the images fade. The medieval village, the herb garden, Agnes by her fire, all of it is dissolving into soft darkness. There's nothing you need to hold onto, nothing you need to remember. It's all just a story, a lullaby, a way of moving gently from wakefulness into sleep. Your breathing is slow and deep. Your body is heavy and relaxed. The bed is comfortable, the room is quiet, and sleep is coming like a slow tide, washing over you, carrying you away to dreams. The herbs are growing in their gardens. The women are going about their lives, making their choices, carrying their knowledge forward. The past is the past, and it's at rest. And you, too, can rest now. You've done what you needed to do today. You've lived your life as best you can. And now it's time to let it all go, time to sink into the soft darkness of sleep. I'll stay with you a little longer, keeping watch while you drift off. There's no hurry. Take all the time you need. The night is long, and sleep is patient. Think of nothing now. Or if thoughts come, let them pass like clouds across a twilight sky. Don't hold on to them. Just watch them drift by and fade away. Your eyelids are heavy. So heavy. Your muscles are loose and warm. There's a soft, comfortable weight pressing you down into the mattress, a gentle gravity pulling you toward sleep. The women of the past send you their blessings. They've walked the hard roads so you don't have to. They've carried burdens so you could be free. They've passed down knowledge, generation after generation, so that we could be here, now, in this moment, with choices they could barely dream of. And in return, we honor them. We remember them. We tell their stories, even as we drift off to sleep. Because they matter. They mattered then, and they matter now. Each life, each choice, each quiet act of courage or defiance or simple survival, it all matters. But for now, let it all rest. Let history rest. Let the questions rest. Let your own thoughts and worries rest. There's nothing that needs your attention right now. Nothing that can't wait until morning. Just sleep. Soft, deep, peaceful sleep. Let it come. Let it take you. Let yourself float away on the dark, quiet river of sleep, down into dreams, down into rest. The candle is burning low. The fire is just embers. The house is settling into stillness. And you, too, are settling, softening, surrendering to sleep. Good night, dear one. Sleep well. May your dreams be gentle, and may you wake refreshed, carrying only the faintest memory of the women we've met tonight, like the scent of dried herbs in an old house. Good night.